Welcome to the Bellevue Brief, a podcast from the team at Bellevue Law, providing insights into topical workplace law and commercial disputes issues. I'm Anjali Malik, an associate at Bellevue Law, and I'm joined by my lovely colleagues at Bellevue Law, with Bellevue Law's founder, Florence Brocklesby, and senior consultant, Joe Martin. So today we're unpacking a topic that sits at the heart of professional services, workplace culture. From ethically poor environments to leadership accountability, we're asking, what does it really feel like to work in a space where values are compromised? And what can be done to change that? Links to resources we mentioned will be included in the blog post accompanying the podcast on Bellevue Law's website. Now, let's dive in. So the first question, let's start with a big one. When you think about workplace culture in professional services, what comes to mind first?
I think for me, I'm afraid, slightly on the negative side. I think the first word that comes to mind is stress. Given what we do see situations in professional services when things have gone very wrong. But I think secrets as well. I think there's a sense of management perhaps saying one thing and then doing another in the experience of a lot of our clients.
And Florence, what about you?
I'm going to make no apologies for sounding like a lawyer, and I'm going to start with a definition about what we're talking about when we're talking about culture. Culture is an environment that's created by an organisation's values, behaviours and attitudes. And much as everybody in the room enjoys a policy and a training, and actually those are very important, culture transcends that, and it's set by the top, it's set by the leadership, and it's the sum of what leaders expect in terms of behaviour and what they tolerate in terms of behaviour. And to Joe's point that we often see the worst of culture because people come to us when they are struggling, particularly our senior executive clients often come to us when they're experiencing very stressful, challenging time at work. And sometimes that is the result of difficulties and issues in the workplace culture. I think maybe the privilege of the work that we do is that we get an insight into quite a wide range of workplace cultures despite that, ranging from organisations that are looking proactively to put in place positive cultures to senior leaders in organisations who are looking to deal with the challenges that are going to arise in any kind of organisation in a good way, and then to the people who we see who are struggling and sometimes damaged mentally and physically even by the culture in which they're operating. And so we probably do have the privilege of an insight into a really wide range of cultures. And having worked in this area for a long time, we've also maybe seen change over time, some change. I think most people would say not enough change yet. And the seismic moment, in my mind, is the Me Too movement, which I think has given rise to an awareness of some of the real issues, particularly in that context, relation to sexual harassment in the workplace and beyond, and some changes that have come as a result of that, which we can maybe dive into a little bit later.
Yeah, absolutely. And similar to what you were saying about the Me Too movement, we've seen reports like the Harman Review recently and sexism in the city. Do you think these reflect isolated incidents or something a bit more systemic?
To my mind, absolutely systemic. And I think what's really exciting about the Harman report is the fact that she talks about power imbalance, for example. And she's really trying to find the reason that the change that we have seen, I absolutely agree, hasn't been enough yet. And this is specifically, the Harman report specifically for the bar, so ordered by the Bar Council, talks a lot about judges as well, but focused on barristers, so focused on examining bullying and harassment at the bar. But rather than sort of rehashing a report that we've probably all seen many times, what she seems to do is zero in on why is this continuing. And what she seems to find is fear, politics, concern about one's career progress, both for the victim, but also bystanders who may choose not to report or say, well, I'm not sure it happened, so I'm not going to report for that reason. Or perhaps they feel that it would have a chilling effect on their own career to support an individual. And certainly the victims would have felt that, and those that have been brave enough to report haven't then got any recourse, or worse, they've suffered for doing so. So to my point of what she's doing differently in that report, she's looking at these reasons, and power imbalance seems to be a really key aspect of that. And that's not something we've really seen before, someone kind of cutting through the noise and being really honest about what perpetuates these things. And what does she do about that in the report? She's making a lot of recommendations. Again, this is for the Bar Council to consider. Will they bring them in? Will they not? This doesn't impact on accountants, doesn't impact on solicitors, but it's very interesting to see a regulatory body seeking this external view of how they're doing and being told, well, there's been a lot of change. There's still a really significant problem. Here's why I think that's happened, and here's what you can do about it. There's, I think, a commissioner for conduct is one of the recommendations, talking about it being unlawful for a barrister to have a sexual relationship with someone in their chambers. That is not allowed if her recommendations are enforced, for example. So some really clear guidance, and then support for those complaining. But you read it and you get a sense of this might actually help. What I would like to see, may have started already, is, for example, the solicitors regulator, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, take its own similar report, because I strongly suspect, given what we do see a lot. This is just one employment lawyer. All employment lawyers in the UK, all HRDs, general counsels at all the big professional services firm, they've all seen what we've seen.
Absolutely.
And we're all involved to a degree in helping, but also covering it up, because you don't speak about these things once you've signed a settlement agreement. Thus, we know there is a lot of this going on.
Yes.
It just doesn't hit the press because the professional firms know how to put it to bed. And thus, that type of report for the SRA, I imagine, would be as seismic as the Harman report.
Yes.
I would hope there'll be a knock-on effect from this report. I think it's very powerful.
It's a very, very powerful report. And actually, although she makes 36 different recommendations, the single most important one is a call for a complete reset on culture. And when we said earlier that, you can have policies and you can have training, but what you actually need is leadership that says, no, this is an acceptable standard of behaviour and this is not an acceptable standard of behaviour. And we will hold everyone to account, no matter how powerful or how important or how commercially valuable they are to our organisation. Because what she also rightly identifies is that there are a number of rights which people already have on paper, but there's a real jeopardy in looking to enforce those. So there's too many times there's a real jeopardy in bringing a complaint. Yeah. Even in succeeding in that complaint, even in achieving, what might be considered to be a good settlement, or in winning a case at a tribunal, there may still be ongoing jeopardy after that, because in professional services, people are working in quite a small world, and there's a jeopardy attached to being seen to be a troublemaker. So the recommendations, I think, are very powerful, and it'll be very interesting to see how and to what extent they're implemented. And it's very clear, if you work in professional services, employment law, that they resonate across the whole of the sector. It's, there are some things in there that are very specific to the bar. So the self-employment, the vulnerability probably of junior barristers and pupils, and their relationship with judges. Those are all unique to the bar. But broadly speaking, the issues around power imbalance, and I think also broader level, and sort of issues around diversity that are driving this. There are lessons for the whole professional services sector from that report.
Absolutely. And can we talk a bit about this concept of rainmaker immunity and the idea that high performers are often shielded from any scrutiny? Is this something that either of you have seen in practice, or and in that, how does it shape workplace culture?
Something that I'm particularly interested in discussing, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, is partnership models in particular. I think absolutely there has always previously been a protection of the rainmaker for obvious reasons. They're paying the bills. I think the bravery to question poor behaviour in professional firms, so in big corporates, is growing, and I think it's working its way up the levels. I think to board level now, we have a lot of clients who are equity partners in all types of professional services, who are challenging behaviours at the highest level of these firms. But what you do still tend to see is a layer of protection for a wrongdoer. Will there always be a sort of secret space for those kinds of protections? And partnership boards are quite vulnerable places to be for those on those boards. And if they were to act decisively against a wrongdoer, let's say you're talking about the chief exec, the chair, their head will be on the block for election in a year's time because of the way in which partnerships self-sustain. Does that cause people to not make the brave decisions and not do perhaps what's right? Is there but I just think the makeup of an equity partnership and how you succeed in that partnership and the collegiality, which is obviously a very good base from which those models come, perhaps perpetuates this protection of someone who has the key client relationship or knows where all the bodies are buried, as it were, or has previously been or still is that rainmaker type because of popularity and the sort of slightly toxic politics you can see in those setups. So I think it happens, and I wonder how partnerships can really do much about that.
It comes back to culture, doesn't it? It comes back to the behaviour that you expect and the behaviour that you tolerate, and how you deal with challenging behaviour. I mean, we've talked briefly about sexual harassment, but we're also talking about maybe bullying, unfair treatment, and concerns that are raised about that. Sets the tone for what will happen throughout the organisation. I think something that I've observed over the years is that the presumption that someone is a rainmaker needs to be gently challenged, because quite often that is done on the basis of kind of looking at the revenue that they may be generating. But obviously we've talked about the fact that there can be a human cost to that if you've got somebody whose behaviours are quite damaging. Going beyond that, I actually think there can be a financial or commercial cost that needs to go onto the balance sheet of that person before we say that they're too big to be allowed to be brought down. You need to think about what the implications are, potentially reputationally for the firm down the line. You also need to think about what the costs are in terms of your ability to recruit and retain talented people, particularly maybe generations coming through that have got higher expectations about what their behaviour will be. And there is an additional business cost in addition to the most important human cost to having people like that in the organisation. Sometimes there's a real bottom line cost because somebody brings a claim or a claim is settled more often, and there's a cost that attaches to that as well. And I think people need to take a step back sometimes thinking about the value that somebody who is commercially successful but creating real challenge culturally brings to the organisation, and have a more balanced scorecard when you're looking at that.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and just to add to that, do you think sometimes to exit the company is often the only option for those who are seeking that ethical alignment? And what does that say about the industry?
I've seen a couple of clients explore alternative resolution that would have them stay on sort of quite progressive ideas, but it's not the norm. The protective, close it down, exit them approach does seem to be preferred. And as Florence says, the cost for that business is great. You've got experienced talent walking out the door. Often, if you've got somebody who has tried their best to work with the culture that they've got, they've worked really hard, perhaps supported the diversity and inclusion policies of the firm, but they're bumping up against this unfairness at the highest level, that leads to a burnout. That leads to the mental health impact, the physical health impact. Most of I think probably every single client I advise is having an impact on their mental health, which also impacts on their physical health, as we all know. Well, they're very, very high achieving, excellent, questioning people, which is why they're often in that situation in the first place. They won't accept their health being railroaded. They will look for alternatives, one of which is to exit. But in doing so, then the business loses that talent, loses that experience. And it's a gain for the ethical sector because many will not go to repeat that experience somewhere where they can't really trust the management.
Yeah, and that's really interesting what you say about burnout amongst ethical leaders. And Florence, do you think this contributes to the gender pay gap or the overrepresentation of women in non-billable DEI work?
So across professional services, I mean, there is a gender gap in terms of seniority, and there is a gender pay gap. And depending on how you measure that, because you may measure it looking only at employees, but if you really measure it looking at partners, you'll really see it. It's a very significant gender pay gap in professional services, which reflects the fact that although there's a extremely balanced intake at the bottom of the pipeline, maybe even predominantly female, as people move through their careers and as they move up within professional services firms, a lot of women tend to fall out of that pipeline for various reasons. I've been a qualified solicitor for 25 years, and I know that my trainee intake was 50-50 male and female, and I think I probably assumed therefore that as people became more senior and as they rose into partnership, the partnership would become more balanced, and across the city generally that probably isn't the way that it's gone, although it's definitely improved in the last 25 years. Real challenges for professional services around retaining women, often to do with the charging model. So if you're charging for time, then you'll be more profitable if people are spending longer doing chargeable work. And often that creates a bit of tension for people who've got other responsibilities outside the workplace. Doesn't have to always be the women who have those extra responsibilities, but in practice it often is.
What I've also seen as well as the responsibilities outside the workplace is a willingness on the part of women in professional services firms to take on the non-billable leadership of what some call the affinity groups or the support networks for the minority communities, which is unbillable. It's unbillable time.
Yeah.
And it's
Absolutely.
billable is king. That's pays the bills, pays the salaries. It's what everyone's rated on. And there's an ongoing fight in many professional services firms to have the non-billable time that is so desperately needed recognised properly. I don't think there's a solution to that. But I have a challenge for any listeners who work in this kind of environment, especially those in leadership. It would be to call a Teams meeting of everyone who leads one of those networks in your organisation, get everyone to put the cameras on and then take a screenshot, because you might find that most of the faces are female.
Yes, absolutely.
And do people ask themselves the question, why should that work be led by people of that minority? Because that's like a double bind, you could say. Is there a discussion about that? Is there awareness of the effort this takes? And also then those people that I said you sort of bump up against the unfairness. If you're leading one of those networks, but you might look for quite bold change and it just might not happen. Maybe those listening who do this kind of work might think of a particular project they just can't get off the ground, or recognition they can't quite establish. Those are the people who are likely to experience, these progressive energetic types will experience that sort of effective rejection of their ideas. They'll realise the nature of the culture that they are in, which professes so publicly, so regularly to be as progressive as they might want it to be. Once the reality sets in, those people are going to be confident enough and employable enough to go. And there is quite a lot of movement amongst those who lead these networks. And I think it's because of this ceiling of aspiration that they unfortunately will hit. But that then it's going to impact the organisation they leave, their gender pay gap because of the overrepresentation of females, but also the ethnicity pay gap, which is something that people are publishing and looking at increasingly. So, I mean, it's just so frustrating, but that's something you definitely see.
Absolutely. And what role do you think partners and senior management should be playing in challenging these problematic behaviours in the workplace?
I think having an anonymous whistleblowing function internally is really, really important, because fear drives so much of the lack of reporting. It discourages reporting. Politics discourages reporting. Florence talked about setting the culture very, very clearly. If at the highest level, the board are all clear on what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, it makes that questioning of the rainmaker or the giant killing, call it what you like, a bit easier. Nobody likes difficult conversations. We all know as employment lawyers, that's something employer clients work with us to feel more confident about and get right. That's a difficult conversation at board level, having to deal with, let's say, a board level partner or an equity partner on their behaviour. But if there is clarity about expectation and it's regularly assessed and it's meaningful,
Yeah.
then perhaps that makes it a little bit more feasible that those changes will happen. I think keep asking questions. If you're in a position of advantage in a professional services firm, you're senior and you have the safety, because not everyone does. People need to pay their mortgages. It's not just because, say, you're a partner, you've got the ability to be strident. But if you feel secure enough, keep asking those questions and keep pushing. That's one way you can contribute to a better culture.
And Florence, do you think that kind of window of tolerance for bad behaviour is narrowing?
Yes. How fast it's narrowing and how thoroughly it's narrowing. I think it's going to remain high on the agenda. We've seen some legal change, some regulatory change in the last few years, and there's more coming down the line. So within our sector, the SRA a couple of years ago brought in a new code of conduct requirement as a personal regulatory responsibility on partners to challenge harassment, bullying, discrimination. I'm not sure that it is always honoured.
It's not. I'd say that was right.
The Worker Protection Act came in about a year ago. It requires businesses to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment. We did see some behaviour change around that. We saw clients and employers taking active steps to assess risks. We saw it came in shortly before the Christmas party season. We saw people thinking about, well, what does that mean for the role of alcohol within this organisation, for social events that have got a work nexus. Kind of a lot of messaging and clarifying expectations around that. And we're definitely seeing more investigations when things go wrong. I mean, things will go wrong in any organisation, but we're seeing organisations then wanting to understand what has happened and to learn lessons from that as well. But particularly if allegations relate to somebody senior, then it just gives genuine independence and integrity to the investigation. And then we've got more changes coming with the Employment Rights Bill, as it is today. We're recording this in October, soon to be the Employment Rights Act. There's going to be, if it passes as we expect it to, there's going to be a requirement to take all reasonable steps to prevent harassment. So that's going to expand that duty that employers already have. And there's going to be a practical ban on the use of non-disclosure agreements or NDAs where there have been allegations of discrimination and harassment. And I think that potentially has the potential to drive quite significant change, because it won't be possible anymore to have a strategy essentially mopping up after somebody. You've got the obligation to take steps to prevent harassment, and you will be very restricted on what you can do to stop people from talking about it after the event. I think that may be a driver of change. But a lot of the behaviour we're talking about is already unlawful. Sometimes it's criminal, and it still occurs, and it's still tolerated. So I think it brings us back to Baroness Harman's report and her key recommendation, which is it's about a real reset of culture, and that can only happen if it comes from the very top of organisations and from professions as well.
Absolutely. And I'd be interested to know if we've got any listeners at the moment have tuned in and they're thinking that their ethical beliefs conflict with their employers and what's happening in the workplace. What advice would you give to them? What should they do? How can they speak out? They're too scared to speak out. Mm-hmm. They're feeling conflicted. What advice do you have for those people?
So I would look and see what your organisation has in terms of those kinds of facilities. Often you might not realise it, but they perhaps on the intranet might have an anonymous whistleblowing support line. Perhaps call your regulatory body. They will often have an ethics type line that you don't need to give your name to speak to work out if it's a particular tangle that you feel that you're in. Take advice, consider raising a grievance. The moment you do that, particularly if it's about a discrimination aspect, you have a protection in law. Sometimes that won't feel very protective, just knowing that you do, but you do. Yeah. When you put your head above the parapet in that way, that can feel quite exposing. You are protected against victimisation, protected against detriment for blowing the whistle. So having a lawyer helping you through that, I would say this, given my job, but it can make you see that there is a strategy, in a non-cynical sense of the word, that you can deploy to think, well, I'm doing the right thing by my ethics and I'm relatively safe in terms of my job. I say relatively because it never feels particularly pleasant having to do any
Absolutely.
of that stuff, but at least you know you can't be sacked for doing it, for example.
Is there anything you wanted to add there, Florence?
I think it's right to say, think carefully. You have a number of rights. And these reports that we've been talking about also talk about where the jeopardy sits. So it's something that people should think carefully about doing. But I'm hopeful that we're going to see the cultural change that will make it safer for people to do that going forwards. There's another option, which I think people in professional services are taking ever increasingly, and that's just make some different choices, vote with your feet. It will ultimately probably be market forces which drive cultural change. There are so many more, just thinking about our own sector, there are so many more opportunities available to lawyers today than there were 25 years ago. And it might be that the right option, instead of or as well as exercising your internal rights and your legal rights, might be to make a plan to be working in a different way in the future.
Which harks back to the discussion of burnout we had at the start, because I think burnout can start very gradually, and it can start with a compromise of your principles, and then it can become more intense as you find yourself having to fight and maybe file that grievance or go through whatever you're facing in your particular workplace. And it is good to have a strategy to exit if that becomes intolerable.
And something that I've noticed over the years is that you can have, everyone's situation is unique, but you can have clients with quite similar fact patterns, making very different choices about what's the right outcome and what's the right path for them. And I think any way through workplace difficulties that relate to culture needs to be considered, taking into account a wide range of factors. So, thinking about your legal rights, thinking about the financial situation that might lead you in, because you're right to say that, everyone has to pay their mortgage or their rent, thinking about your well-being, thinking about your health, thinking about your career, and thinking about your principles. And all of those in the round will help you to determine the right way for you to proceed if you find yourself in a difficult situation. What might be right for one person might be different from the right outcome for another person, depending on their preferences and their tolerances.
Absolutely.
And just to pivot the conversation slightly, there's growing evidence that ESG-focused companies tend to outperform their peers. Do you think ethical business is also smart business, Florence?
Well, it's something we've given quite a lot of thought to, because about 18 months ago, we certified as a B Corp, and I gave a lot of thought as to why we were doing that. And to some extent, we were doing it just purely because it was the right thing to do. But we're a relatively small firm, and it required quite a significant amount of resource to be invested in the certification process. And I gave quite a lot of thought to whether or not that was going to be something that was going to help us as a business. And I concluded at the time, and 18 months later, I still feel that it has been a massive value to the business from a commercial point of view, as well as from an ethical point of view, from a human point of view, and from a sort of environmental and social point of view. The evidence for financial performance of ethical businesses is it's quite difficult to find any conclusive data on that. And that's for a number of reasons, actually. Firstly, it's quite difficult to measure what is an ethical business. Most businesses will have a little section on their website talking about how ethical they are.
Yeah.
And there are allegations of greenwashing, purpose washing. And we don't, so it's hard to measure from that point of view. There is a study from a few years back, which we can link to in the blog, which talks about ESG funds outperforming non-ESG funds. So that's looking at really stark financial performance of investments. My own experience is that purpose-driven businesses may sometimes make decisions that will be less profitable in the short term. So, for example, there are certain sectors that we've decided that we won't work in, and so there's revenue streams that we don't chase, but that they are more stable and more sustainable. Not just talking about that from an ethical point of view or an environmental point of view, but actually more sustainable businesses over time. And I know that B Corp UK has recently published some studies that show that B Corps have greater revenue growth, greater headcount growth than non-B Corp businesses. And so I think there's a lot of attraction there. And my own experience is that it's enabled me to hire wonderful colleagues. It's part of what attracts people who are looking to work in a particular way, quite like-minded, and then that will hopefully create a positive culture and high levels of retention and success for the business.
Absolutely. Thank you, Florence. And just before we wrap up, Jo, what advice would you give to someone who's entering the profession today who wants to stay true to their values? Is it possible?
I think it's certainly possible, thanks to the types of businesses that Florence has just been talking about. I will put my cynical hat back on, though. It's a great hat. And say that I personally wouldn't advise that individual to work for a partnership where the equity is not genuinely diverse in all the ways that individual would want to see. Do you know where the power sits in that company you're thinking about joining? If not, if that's not transparent, that would already give me a cause for concern. I don't think that a really non-diverse group of people at the very top of an organisation will be as committed to becoming a more progressive organisation, reflective of its workforce and its client base, as it will say it wants to.
Thank you, Jo. Well, that's all for today's episode on the Bellevue Brief. We've explored the uncomfortable truths behind workplace culture in professional services and the cost of staying silent. If you're entering the profession and want to stay true to your values, remember, your voice matters and change starts with courage. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.